Okay, we're live. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, colleagues. It's 5 o'clock, so I will call the Otonabee Region Conservation Authority regular Board of Directors meeting for October 21st, 2021 to order. And we'll begin with our land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that we are on the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga and Ajipec. We offer our gratitude to First Peoples for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. So we've circulated the agenda. Does anybody have any additions? No? Somebody wants to move acceptance of that? Okay, Joe and Carl, all those in favor? And it is adopted. Any disclosure of conflict of interest on any of the items in the agenda? Madam Clerk, please note there were none. We have no delegations today, but we do have our minutes of September the 16th, 2021, which were circulated as part of the package. Is there any questions or issues about those minutes? I don't see any, so I'll entertain a motion to receive. Joe?
Mr. Chair, before we move on, I wondered if you had overlooked the land acknowledgement that we typically begin.
I did it.
You did it.
I did it.
I blinked till I missed it. Sorry.
Were you asleep, Joe?
I must have been.
That's okay. When we go into closed, I'll do it again. So, but no, I did. So anybody? So Joe, will you move the minutes? Yeah. Okay. Second it by. Okay, Paula. Okay. All those in favor? Barry. Any business arising from the minutes?
No.
Okay. Not seeing any, we will go to our first report, which is the draft budget and levy. So as colleagues are aware, we get it described to us today, and then it will come back. We will advise our member municipalities, and then we'll come back 30 days from now where we're actually looking for approval. So Dan, I think you have a bit of a presentation you want to go through?
Yeah, Karen's going to put up a few slides to help me be a bit coherent about what I'd like to say. So Karen, if you could.
You're always coherent, Dan. You're always
okay.
coherent.
Yeah.
And I see Mayor Therrien has joined the call.
Yeah, thank you. And Councillor Baldwin should be on too. We just wrapped up the PUC meeting, so.
Okay.
Starting late.
So Karen, can you share that slide deck? Great. If we could go to the next slide then. So I'd like to just like to set a context here for a budget. A budget always is about you know, a statement of revenue and expenditures and an understanding of what we're attempting to accomplish with that money in the context of a 12-month period. But what I've been finding, and in particular this year, was a real challenge is that you know, this budget is really in the context of almost a five-year picture. Back in 2019, we lost some provincial grants, and we started the conversation around mandatory and non-mandatory programs and the need to move to municipal agreements to support non-mandatory activities going forward. And all of that has kind of come to be a little bit, although it's only the start of a 2-year process. But in that context, we've had a pandemic, and the pandemic has skewed some of our activities and our revenue projections, and we're kind of rebounding out of that. So I'd just like to maybe speak for a moment to the kind of drivers that we considered and that influenced us in the preparation of this document. So what we saw this year in particular is a large increase in planning and permitting applications. And some of it was a release of the pent-up demand that was interfered with in the first year of the pandemic. But I think our observation today is that we're getting through the pandemic bottleneck, and we're actually in a new world. And that new world is driven by the price of housing. It's driven by the response and increase in development activity, whether it's a provincial housing policy or simply the markets. But we are in the start of probably a multi-year phase of large developments occurring across the watershed. We've saw increased use of our conservation areas and campgrounds. And next year in 2022, we hope to return to a more normal campground operation, and that includes group camping and canoe rentals, and we'll open the Warsaw Caves to visitation. So we're getting back to a kind of a normal operation, but we do anticipate visitation to be much larger than the 5-year average. We're also seeing this year a return of events and educational activities. What we're doing now this fall, what we did this fall with high school age groups is as busy as it was before the pandemic. And we expect that as the vaccination program works its way through elementary schools, that they'll be back to normal in some way, or some closer to normal, or closer to the past in many respects in next year. In all of this, and all of you would experience this in your municipal context, we're seeing a lot more complaints and non-compliance activities. And it's both on our conservation lands as well as around our permitting activities. So these are some of the real, to us, some of the significant drivers of work and effort. On the regulatory front, we now know what the regulatory requirements are for the three principal programs in the legislation. We know that through the course of the next few months and into the next year, we're going to see regulatory changes that affect fees and levy. And we know we now have to begin to negotiate cost apportioning agreements for non-mandatory programs, negotiate these agreements with our member municipalities. Whether they support us or not will start to tell the tale around the direction of the levy going forward. So those are the contextual pieces. If we could go to the next slide, Karen. All of this has kind of led us to a kind of a challenge where we're trying to find the balance. We're trying to really understand and address the post-pandemic driven changes to the demand in our programs and the changes in our programs. We're trying to do that in a context of transitioning to complete or fulfill new mandatory requirements and adjustments. And we're doing all of that while some of the rules around revenue are going to be reconsidered and adjusted. Next slide, please. So through the course of preparing the budget, we picked up a couple of strategies and tactics to help guide us. One of the things we said we absolutely had to do is to try to get us back to a pre-pandemic full-time equivalent count. And that's not a large number. In this budget, we're looking for 23.7 FTEs, and pre-pandemic, we were around 23.8. So we're really just trying to get back to where we were. And in 2021, we were down to about 22. So it's almost the equivalent of 2 full-time equivalents. But we're not trying to increase the permanent staff complement. What we're going to do is do this through contract positions and then contracted services. And in the midst of all of that, we have experienced some challenges with recruiting one position, and we think it's a compensation issue. So we have commissioned a review of our compensation framework. I expect the board will see the results of that probably at the December meeting. So we made an allowance in the budget for an adjustment to the compensation framework, including a COLA allowance. We have not attributed to positions at this point. We're waiting for that study to come back. We tried to take a look at the multi-year requirements, especially the new regulatory requirements, and schedule them out over really what's the 3-year window. There are some things that have to be in place in a 2-year cycle, 2-year window, and there's some things then will have to be delivered in the 3rd year. And what we've done is we tried to pick a few of those things to start to implement next year, especially where those things can also help us mitigate the impacts of changing workload in the normal business. So the example on that is we're trying to beef up our engineering services to deal with current workload-driven pressures, as well as get ourselves ready to deal with some of the requirements under the new regulatory requirements. So kind of we carefully picked and chose things that would help the problem today while positioning us to meet the new requirements in 2 and 3 years' time. We also had to really take a look at our self-generated revenues, and they shrunk last year. They've rebounded this year, and we made what I'm considering a modest adjustment. A conservative adjustment is rate of inflation. A modest is something beyond that, and a Hail Mary pass is something way beyond that. So we're more of a modest but aggressive expectation on self-generated revenues. And we are looking to draw down the reserve in 3 instances to, in part, handle one-off projects. We don't have any project money that we can redeploy. Everything is really consumed in programming. So we're looking at drawing reserve for one-off projects and to mitigate or to bridge a resourcing need until the fee revenue can come online in another year's time. And finally, a bit of a funny year for us. We've stopped, or we are eliminating the special benefiting levy. The work that needed to be funded has all been completed. That's the Millbrook Dam, the Warsaw Dam is almost complete, but we don't have any resourcing needs to undertake major capital repairs. So we're eliminating the special benefiting levy. But we are asking for a 2.9% increase in the operating levy and a 2% increase in the general capital levy. And if we go to the next slide, please, Karen. So all of that, so just on the levy and what it means to your home municipalities, I've given one column there indicates what your municipalities paid in 2021 to get us to a 1.552 million levy. The levy this year is 1.352, so $200,000 less. Here's the amounts by municipalities, and it has variable impacts to you. So Cavan Monaghan and Douro Dummer, who have been paying 90% of the special levy for 2 different purposes, that's gone. So they'll see a significant reduction on a year-over-year basis. Everybody else will see some sort of change, and that change, actually, the variability there is the apportionment of the market value is CVA has changed. So your percentages move around every year, anyways. So that's what the impact to the levy is. So those are my opening comments, Mr. Chair. I'm just trying to hit the highlights of what drove us, what our major considerations were, what the context was. And also speak a little bit about really what's happening on the levy at a very practical level. So I think we can take the slides down, Karen. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you, Dan. I suspect there might be the odd question or two. Who wants to go first? Jerry.
Thank you, through you. So Dan, are you planning to bring the budget to each of the townships and make a presentation?
Yes, thanks. I always extend the offer. I very rarely get invited now. Having said that, I'm waiting for a time slot for City of Kawartha Lakes. They've asked all agency boards and commissions to be available next Tuesday. And so I'm waiting if they want me or not. And but I haven't heard from any other municipalities yet. But in our letter, I will offer a visit.
Okay, and a question that we may get from our other members of council is the budget deals with the regulatory. Are you planning on going again to each municipality with a laundry list of the non-regulatory to see which ones they might choose? And we have to make it clear that there may be other charges involved.
So yes, yeah, to answer your question, yes, but the implications of that are not until 2024. So this is the 22 budget. there are no laundry list items at this point. We have to present to the member municipalities our program and service inventory at the end of February. I'll provide an opportunity at that point again to meet and receive feedback. And there may be a request in there for their support through what's called an cost apportioning agreement for their support for non-mandatory programs. There may be. To get to that point, though, I want to come to the board in December with here's the deck of cards. Which game do you want to play, and which things do you want to advance? And then we'll assemble that for the February submission. So there's going to be a step for the board to give me direction on go big or go small or go home. And then we'll take that direction. We'll come back with the program and service offerings for the board to confirm in February, and we'll release it at the end of February. Then we'll be available for a conversation about that.
Thank you.
Carl.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Dan. On the strictly operating levy, the proportionate, is it, or a portion of it meant, is it allocated based on assessment? I noticed the city is, their operating alone is increased by 2.3, and all of the rest of us are 3.3 to 5.5.
Yep.
Is it assessment?
And
So
annual, we get those assessment values from the province, and annually they shift.
So the assessment in the county is going up big time.
Relative to the city of Peterborough, it has changed, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I had just wanted to point out a couple of things to colleagues on the budget. So if you look at it, you'll see there's a fairly significant increase in staffing costs. And I think it's important to remember that for the most part, we're returning back to levels that we were at previously, and we're being driven by increased volumes. So when somebody at your municipalities dig into the budget, they'll see that there's this increase in staffing. It's important that the comparison be back to 2019, not just simply back to 2020, because we, during COVID, actually reduced, and now we're ramping back up. So that's the first point I'd like to make. The second point is there is what I refer to as a $70,000 risk in this budget. Okay, and so what I mean by that is we're drawing $50,000 on reserve to hire or to contract, would be a better way, and would correct me on that, to contract an engineer. In all probability, we're going to need that engineer in 2023, probably beyond. And so next year, we're either going to have to bring that $50,000 into levy, or we're going to have to draw again from reserve. So we're not putting into the levy this year, we're drawing it from reserve. So that's what I refer to as a risk factor. The other factor is we've included in our operating revenue about $20,000 from a forestry sale that we'll have available to us this year. That's a one-time revenue, but it's into our revenue. So we're going to have to fill that hole because that revenue won't exist in 2023. But I just wanted to point out to colleagues that there's that risk. Now, the reality is, if the world unfolds according to how it would appear, that we will have fee increases in 2023 on our fee side for reasons that Dan mentioned earlier, that will allow us to close that $70,000 gap. But I just want to make sure that colleagues were aware of that. The other thing that colleagues may want to know is that there is a $50,000 one-time reserve to assist draw on reserve to assist us with the various costs that we are going to incur as a result of meeting the new regulations to meet the government. Excuse me, I can't even say this. There's a lot of work that has to be done to meet the new legislative and regulatory requirements that the government is putting forward. So that's there. That's not a risk. It should only be a one-time expense. And the other thing to note is there's a $50,000 increase in the operating budget. This is in the budget, so it's there for future years. That will deal with the results of our salary review, because it will probably have recommendations on some positions to readjust that, as well as the cost of living increase that might be put forward. So that's a placeholder in a sense, in that it's in the operating budget, but we don't know exactly what it will. We don't know exactly what it will be. To Sherry's point, if you go to, I believe it's pages 18 and 19, or 19 and 20 of Dan's actual budget document, there are two categories in there. One of them, and Dan, correct me if I get it wrong, one of them is the natural resource conservation program, and the other is our education program. When it's page 18 and 19, I think.
Yep.
We'll see there's levy in there. Those are just to try to bring some substance to all of the changes that are happening. Those are the areas where those services, not in 2022 or 2023, but in 2024, will become discretionary services. They come out of the mandatory. So that's the piece that Sherry is talking about, that, okay, we'll come in 2024 with a levy request, but we're also going to say, these are the things we used to do out of the levy. We're no longer allowed to charge a levy for this. Are you in or out of this program? So that's to Terry's point. We've got, and we'll go into this later when we talk about the actual regulatory change. The government did make some changes, which is going to make this a little easier for us to implement. And that was all I wanted to say. I see Gary has his hand up. Dan, did you want to comment on what I got wrong about that?
Yeah, the only, I'd make a comment on your last observation. When we just simply take all the numbers throughout and try to organize it around mandatory, municipal, and other, I'll tell you that on a first cut of that, 68% of our budget is mandatory, 17% is municipal services, and the balance, which is 15%, is other programs and service. But if I only look at the apportionment of the levy, 97% is mandatory. So 90% of our 7% of our levy is allocated to mandatory programs and services, and only 3% is allocated to other. So very efficient use of the levy in terms of intended use. But some of the other stuff is very dependent on fees, fee for service, self-generated revenues. And I think that's kind of the model that the government's looking for. So we have some incremental steps to take, but we are talking pennies in the scheme of things, I think, in 2 years' time.
Well, I think it's a testament, Dan, to the way you've positioned the organization. So thank you for that. Gary?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thanks for your comments there. Just a caution to the board. I mean, it's okay to draw on reserve occasionally, but I don't think you want to get into the habit of depleting all of your reserves. I don't think that's the way to budget. I liken it to my own personal circumstance. If you don't put a little bit away out of every paycheck, undoubtedly something will come up, and it's nice to be able to have a reserve to do that. And in terms of the Conservation Authority, if we have some catastrophic event or some unforeseen thing that occurs, it's nice to be able to have a reserve to handle that. So, I think your comments are correct in terms of what you'd said, but just a caution there that I think building up reserves is a prudent and good way to manage your funds, and we shouldn't be depleting all of our funds on an annual basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Any other comments about the budget? Okay, I don't see any. So Dan, just help me with next steps. So what we would do is we would receive this for information at this point. That, or do we actually, here, I've got it right here. So I'll read it. That the report be received, that the notice of the proposed 2022 operating and capital budget and levy be sent to the member municipalities pursuant to the requirements of Ontario Reg 13996, that the proposed 2022 operating and capital budget be voted on at the next regular meeting of the board following the 30-day notice period required by same reg, and that's a weighted vote, and resolve that staff be authorized and directed to do all things necessary to give effects to these resolutions. So that's what you want.
Yes, sir.
Okay, is somebody prepared, Sherry? Prepared to move that? Thank you. And to second it? Diane? Okay, all those in favor? That is carried. Thank you, Dan. And thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Dan. There's a significant amount of work put into this, and there's oodles of information for us as board members to look at. So that's very much appreciated, and I'm sure colleagues feel the same way. So.
Thank you, board. If I could also thank Denise here. She knows the numbers. If it wasn't for her, I would certainly put a 0 in the wrong spot. So thank you, Denise.
Thanks to Denise as well. Okay, our next board report is the nomination committee report, and nobody run away.
Sorry, Andy, can I just, Chair Mitchell, Councillor Zippel has told me she's having issues accessing the link. I was going to try to send it to her, but I'm wondering if Denise can also send it to her.
I have sent it to her. I've been texting her to see if she's getting it, but she's not texting me back, so I don't know. And Karen is aware as well, so we're trying to work on it.
Okay, I just was texting with her because I realized she wasn't on the meeting and wanted to make sure everything was okay.
Yeah. Did you use her? Sorry, Diane, did you use her cell phone?
I texted her on WhatsApp. We have a WhatsApp chat. But I will. So I will send her the link through that.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt, but I will do that. Thanks.
Yeah, I tried. I don't know if it works or not to resend it. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Hopefully she can get in. Okay, nomination committee report. Dan, did you want to speak to this?
Yes, thanks. So normally we bring this report to the board in November, but because of the amendments to the legislation that provides or puts restrictions on the board for reappointing chair, vice chair, and terms of office and whatnot, and in putting restrictions, they've also created an exemption process with the permission of the minister. We can get exemptions or relief from those restrictions. We decided when amending our governance bylaws earlier in the year that we would bring this forward a month earlier, so the nomination committee could think through the question of whether they would recommend to the board to seek an exemption. And if they do, that gave us sufficient time to ask for it and hopefully receive it prior to the annual meeting. On the other hand, they choose not to advance a recommendation for an exemption, then they just have an extra month to create their slate of officers for the annual meeting in January. So, Mr. Chair, I think you have to find the 3 most enthusiastic board members to fill this role.
Okay. Who wants to volunteer? Paula does. Thank you, Paula. So Paula volunteers. So she's the chair. Joe is a member, and Diane is a member. There we go. Diane, you did volunteer, right?
I will volunteer, yes.
Yeah, and Joe, you volunteered, and Paula has volunteered. I'll let the 3 of you figure out who chair is. But that's so
I'm not volunteering to chair.
I'll leave that to the committee. I just want to raise one point for colleagues. As you are aware, I am the chair of Conservation Ontario. And in order to be the chair of Conservation Ontario, I need a seat on the council. So, to have a seat on council, I have to be the designated representative for conservation or for autonomy conservation. I don't need to be the chair. You may note that we actually nominate that person differently. Traditionally, we've made it the chair, but I would, ask the committee to consider in making its appointments if it might want to consider that, because that's the only way that I could continue in that position. Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When does the Conservation Board need to make that decision as to who the representative will be on Conservation Ontario?
No, that's our decision. We decide who our representative is.
But when? Yeah, when does that decision need to be
Oh, at our
made?
AGM, sorry, at our AGM. It's part of our nomination
Okay,
process.
all right, thank you.
Just traditionally, we've tied that position and the board chair's position together. Anyway,
Okay.
okay.
So
We've
need
got
a
our
mo-
committee. We need a resolution to appoint those folks. So why didn't somebody who's not on the group, Carl, seconded by Gary, all those in favor? Thank you for stepping up, colleagues. And we'll then go on to our Ode to Peterman pledge. And Dan, are you going to speak to that, or?
Well, I will speak to it until I have to pronounce the name of the pledge, and then I'll hand it off to somebody who can do it better than I. But I think everyone is familiar with this initiative, led by the tourism organization in the community and working with the 2 First Nations in the community. And we're bringing it to the board to make a formal resolution to adopt the commitments that are outlined in the pledge. I don't know if Karen wants to speak to anything beyond that. We're gonna do some promotion of it in our social media and the like, perhaps some signage at some of our sites, that kind of thing. But we'll demonstrate a commitment to making people aware of it and making people aware that we support it.
And just before we get into the conversation, I'm going to assume, Kim, that's you showing up as a telephone on my screen. So you can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, very good. Okay.
Can you hear me, Mr. Chair?
Yes, we can. Can you hear us?
Yeah, yeah, my apologies. I can't get the links to work today. They just won't load for me. So here I am by phone.
Okay, so at each vote, I'll just ask you to unmute yourself and you can say yay or nay.
Okay, thank you. I understand, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so sorry for the interruption. Karen, did you want to say anything?
Sure. Through you, Chair. I just think that this is a really great way for us to connect our visitors to our campgrounds and our trails and our conservation areas, to respect and honor the land and the water and each other, and to enjoy the nature and the watershed in a way that we all can enjoy it. I think there's a really great fit with the pledge, and I think it would really set a great tone for our visitors moving forward. And I think it's also a really great way for the board and staff as well to honor the teachings of the First Nations.
Thank you. I know from County Council's perspective, most of us have been familiar with it. I'm not sure about the city and our other members, but Joe, did I see your hand up?
Yes, you did, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Yes, Dan, are you ready for this? The Ode to Peterman pledge was an initiative from Peterborough Court of Tourism, and it was brought to County Council's attention and all the respective townships after that. And it's a great initiative. I was very impressed with it. And I certainly think that it's we're unanimous in agreement that this is a message that needs to be spread right across the city and county of Peterborough, certainly within all of Orca's watershed. There's many places where it can be used and should be paid attention to. So I just can't imagine the board not supporting this, and I look forward to the vote. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Joe. Any other questions or comments? Sherry?
Is there any thought to having the pledge posted at our campgrounds?
Yeah, I think Karen has built a bit of some initial ideas into the report there, but that's one of the things we've been talking about as well as some sort of posting here in our building for whenever the front door opens for people to come in, that kind of stuff. Yep.
Okay. Any other comments? Ryan?
Yeah, through you, Chair. I guess if Joe is moving the report with his enthusiasm, I'm happy to second it.
Okay. So Joe and Ryan, any other comments? Not seeing any, I'll call the vote. All those in favor? Kim?
Aye.
Okay,
Aye,
unanimous.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Okay, we will move on to report number 4, our vaccination policy. Dan, you want to speak to that?
Sure. I think most are familiar with organizations adopting a vaccination policy. The policy before you is one that's being shared amongst conservation authorities. It was prepared by Hicks Morley, one of the HR law firms out of Toronto. Does work for several CAs, so we've simply swapped in our name for others and adopted it. I think you'll notice here that we've identified that it's a policy that applies to employees, volunteers, and board members, and obviously when it comes to non-compliance, I can only deal with volunteers and staff in terms of discipline. But it's there. I would say that across the organization, I think everyone's vaccinated and sensitive to that. So I don't anticipate any challenges now. I think perhaps when it comes to hiring in the new year for the campgrounds and things like that, we might run into a few people, but it'll be a condition of employment that they provide proof. So we'll be hiring in accordance with the policy. So I don't see us having a challenge here with implementation or acceptance by the staff and others that work with us.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions or observations? Carl?
I was going to move the recommendation.
Okay, moved by Carl. Is there a seconder? Gary is seconding it. There's a host of people have their hands up. Are there any questions about it? I have one, and just it's a technical thing, and maybe I missed it because the other policies that I've looked at defines what fully vaccinated is, and I didn't see a definition in there, and I may have missed it.
It's in the footnote on page 1 of the policy document. Fully vaccination.
Okay.
Full vaccination means having received full series of.
Yeah.
And we know that if the health agencies say, well, you need a booster or a third vaccination, that becomes a new standard, and we would just modify the policy to reflect the new standard for fully vaccinated. So.
Okay, and it applies to staff, the board, volunteers, but not to contractors.
Not to contractors.
Okay, good. Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Dan, if this policy is approved, then do you require board members to submit proof of vaccination to somebody in the authority here?
That would be what the policy says, yeah. And all we're
That's-
simply asked, we're not going to keep a we're going to keep a record. We're not going to keep documentation. So if someone wants to show us their vaccination certificate, we'll say we've seen it.
Right. And so, Dan, would it be acceptable then just to submit an electronic copy of that second confirmation vaccination?
Yeah, yeah. If there's an easier way of doing it where we don't have to keep a record of it, keeping records, well, we can keep all those records confidential. So that would be adequate. Yes.
Okay.
Mike?
Thank you. Just going off what Andy asked about contractors, in the budget that we are looking at, we're talking about filling positions with contract services instead of full employees. Are they considered employees of the conservation during their contract?
Yeah, we currently purchase services from 2 conservation authorities. And when they attend our work site, we treat them as if they're an employee of the organization. So in that case, we would ask for the certification. But if somebody comes in to fix our HVAC system, for instance, that'd be a bit of a different, that would be more of a pure contract. Yeah. In fact, good point. I think what we'll do in our service arrangements with those CAs, we'll make it clear that we expect their staff attending our work site to comply with this policy.
Good point. Good point. Thanks, Mike. Okay. I don't think there's any question. Did I had a mover and a seconder?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
That is adopted. Thank you, Kim. Okay, we have some reports for information. Is there anything, Dan, that you want to bring up on your monthly CAO report?
No, nothing particular.
The province finally came back and responded to the input from the regulations. I'm speaking to report number 2. There were 3 significant changes. One, the implementation date goes from January 1st, 2023 to January 1st, 2024. So instead of having 1 year, we had 2 years to adopt to the new processes. So Dan alluded to that earlier in the conversation with Sherry. Second of all, passive recreation, which in the original proposal was going to be a non-mandatory service, becomes a mandatory service. So something like Harrowtown, the Selwyn Beach, those are considered passive recreation. We have lots more, and they could now be levied for. A big income generating items such as, well, Halton, I guess, owns a ski hill type of thing, that would not be considered passive recreation. So that is a significant change. And the third one is the concept of advisory boards, rather than being mandatory, become discretionary. So we can have them if we want them. If we don't want them, we don't have to. So those were the 3 major changes. There were some other minor tweaks here and there, but those were the 3 main asks that conservation authorities, I think, across the province asked for. And so it was good to see that the new minister and his staff took seriously the representation from the various conservation authorities and made the change. And so that was something that we were happy to see them make those changes. I don't know if anybody has any questions on that. Dan, did you want to add to that? I think that.
Well, I can offer to just walk through the slide deck that was attached, or if there are questions on the content, I can deal with the questions.
Would colleagues like to see the slide deck? Just run through it. Joe says yes, so go ahead.
Okay, Karen, could you put that up for us, please? Okay, if you go slide 2, please. So Andy, this is a bit repetitive to what Andy just said. This was released on October, well, we became aware of it on October 7th, but it was registered in the Gazette on October 4th. There are 3 regulations, one defining what are mandatory programs and services. The second is defining this planning, transition planning and agreements we must put in place for with our member municipalities and how to go about doing that. The third is actually just a rewrite of the rules of conduct in our conservation areas. The last point is that there is not a regulation that deals with establishing a community advisory board. So next slide. So the first bit of program and service is the one dealing with natural heritage or natural hazards rather. If you, in the next 3 kind of segments here, if you think first of all at the high level, we need a strategy, and then we're authorized to implement a whole bunch of services to support the delivery of that particular objective. So in this case, natural hazards, we need first of all, it's broadly related to more than flooding, so it's low water erosion. If we were on the Great Lakes coast, it'd be coastal erosion and the like. And what we need to do is make sure we have an overall sense of what the hazard areas are in our jurisdiction, what the risk of to those hazards are. So are they high impacted flood areas or shallow flood areas, that kind of thing. And we put in place a kind of a series of activities and actions that will mitigate those risks. And finally, we can promote that through public awareness. And in developing this strategy, we're authorized to study and collect all kinds of information to help quantify the location and characteristics of these hazards. So the work we did in floodplain mapping is an example of that. Next slide. Once you understand in a strategic way or a broad way where your hazards are, and next slide, Karen, please. Once you understand kind of, where the spots of concern are and broadly what you're going to do to mitigate that, there's a bunch of program activities we're required to do, and we do most of these already. We do flood forecasting and warning. We do drought and low water response. We don't do ice management. Ice management primarily deals with riverine situations where ice can form and create dams. And in our circumstance, a real principal river that occurs on is the Otonabee, and that's federally regulated. We can operate, maintain, repair structures that provide flooding management or flow augmentation. We've spoken earlier about we own a couple of dams that power mills. And though those dams also do flow augmentation, they're not real flood management things. So we're kind of in the gray area there. We are authorized to continue to represent the Crown, the province, and providing comments on natural hazard concerns in different planning instruments. And we have a Section 28 permit to administer and enforce. So in this area, kind of our work going forward is reviewing everything we've got and creating that strategic look and putting our actions into a context, and then just getting on with continuing to operate the kinds of services that we've got listed here that we do right now. Next slide, please. On conservation lands, again, the first task is to prepare a strategy for our land holdings, a strategy that will help guide us in the acquisition and disposition of properties, will help us understand where permitted activities or mandatory activities like recreation and natural heritage protection can occur, and contrast that to things like commercial forestry, which is not a mandatory activity, nor is aggregate pits, and we own an aggregate pit, although it's not operational. So it's basically your land inventory, what's going on, and what's your strategic framework for managing your properties. The other thing that's kind of interesting too is they expect the strategy to also do an assessment of how our properties help landscape level natural heritage protection, and how our properties help for support publicly accessible recreational trails. So a couple meetings ago, we talked about a a trail system between Young's Point and Lakefield, or Bobcade or Burley and Lakefield through Young's Point. And that's an example of a kind of a broader trail system, and our lands play a component part of it. So that's contemplated here. We have to make this strategy publicly available and consult on it before it's finalized. And finally, we have to prepare a very mechanical inventory of our lands and understand where grants were received and what constraints or conditions are on the land from on title and that kind of stuff. So that's a very mechanical thing, but we have to make that available as well. Next slide. On the mandatory activities, all the things any reasonable landowner would do to take reasonable care of their land and protect themselves from liability. So things like signage, fencing, dealing with unlawful entry, that kind of thing. A whole suite of maintenance activities to support recreational activities, cutting lawn to grading parking lots to fixing a boat launch, that kind of thing. A whole suite of activities that help with conserving natural heritage, managing invasive species, primarily, but any other things, insect damage, that kind of stuff. And actually tree planting is a permitted activity just for the sake of tree planting. What's not a mandatory activity is commercial logging. So forest thinning operations will not be a mandatory thing. The language in the legislation speaks to activities that require direct support or supervision. And he gave the example of Halton having a ski hill. Well, that wouldn't qualify, that'd be non-mandatory. And the way they worded this is we can do all these stewardship things on our lands, but it doesn't mean we can do stewardship on others' lands or other people's land, private land. That's a non-mandatory thing, and that would actually be covered under other programming. So that's this framework. Next slide, please. The third broad area is what they call other programs and services, but it really is framed under a watershed-based resource management strategy, guiding principles and assemblage of all the technical studies and information from monitoring programs and what we know about water resources, how it moves through the watershed. It becomes a contextual piece for water-related programming, such as these provincially mandated activities around monitoring and source water protection. And it also could include things like our 5-year periodic watershed report cards, at least for the water side of it. So those are the three kind of broad buckets. Each bucket has a high level framework or framework strategy in place, and then there's a bunch of activities or services underneath that support that. I think that's kind of there's a visual, think of 3 heads with a bunch of strings out to a wide breadth of activities. Okay, next slide. So important dates from that is we need to have this, we need to be delivering these programs and services by the beginning of 2024. And in the regulations, there's some specific deliverables like the conservation area strategy and the conservation land inventory. Those are required to be completed and in place by the end of that calendar year. So it's three operating years to do those things, but the strategies and getting the programs in place, not strategies, but getting the programs and services by and large in place need to be done in 2 years' time. Okay, next slide. So the second regulation is around transition, and it lays out direction and process and content for developing the cost apportioning agreements with our participating municipalities. And the agreements are to fund non-mandatory programs and services. The transition date, so these things have to be in place by January 1, 2024. And for the 2024 budget year, we can only assess a levy that supports a mandatory program, or we can assess a levy to support a non-mandatory program to those municipalities that have signed a cost apportioning agreement. So this, back to the earlier question from Sherry, we'll present our inventory next February, go through a process, people agree to support or not support. Where they've agreed to support, we can only then levy starting 2024 for those services. Next slide. So the next practical and tactical steps is by the end of this calendar year, we have to provide the minister with a plan, a work plan, on how we will work through the preparation of an inventory and in the consultations that need to occur to secure these agreements. We have to provide the minister, we have to provide the member municipalities with this plan, and we have to post it on our website. Next slide. And in phase one, which is the end of February, we have to prepare our inventory. We have to categorize them in the buckets of mandatory, municipal, or other. We have to give an estimate of the costs based on a 5-year average, the source of funding historically, and just the percentage splits. And we have to indicate where we would like, where we are seeking support through a cost apportioning agreement. This inventory has to also be posted, and we have to keep a record of the comments we receive from our municipalities and others, and how we address those comments. And if we choose to adjust our inventory, we just have to show the continuity of communications on that, comments in, how we've considered it, and whether the changes are. So just to make it a little more transparent. Next slide, please. Phase two, once you get the inventory out, phase two is then to consult. There was earlier on an opportunity for municipalities to give approval. There is no longer an opportunity for approval. It's simply to consult. And if they choose to enter into agreement, we put in place an agreement. And we have to provide the minister with progress reports starting on July 1st, 2022, quarterly reports up until the time this is completed. And then at the conclusion, which is for January 1, 2024, we have 30 days to do a wrap up and make a final submission to the minister of where we landed on everything. Okay, next slide, please. The third regulation was the rules of conduct in CAs. Today, there are 36 individual CA regulations that are patterned off of a provincial template. And upon proclamation, all the 36 will be gone or stricken and replaced by this new provincial reg. In reading it, there's not a lot of change between what we have right now as a set of rules and what's in the new reg. The only thing I would say is the language around pets and pets off leash or pets on leash is a little more clear than the old legislation, the old regulations. And I'm told, and I don't quite see the mechanics on this yet, but this will come into effect when a certain section of the act itself is proclaimed. So it's not in effect today, but it will be in effect. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, we will open a dialogue with the municipalities around what the journey looks like. And I have drafted up a transition plan, which I will share with them and invite them to give me any suggestions on changes and timelines. I will bring that to the board in December, and then we will file it with the minister after the board's endorsement. We will start to work on our program and service inventory. Substantively, it won't really look much different than the budget you just reviewed in terms of how we structured everything. There's some number stuff we have to work out a bit, but it'll be substantively what you've seen today in the budget. So we'll work on that, and then we'll bring that into the board in February for support, and then hopefully receive that support and submit it or send it out to our member municipalities at the end of February on the due date. And I'll probably set up a 60-day window to meet with member municipalities at their convenience and/or take any other questions. And then at some point, probably think that through, probably for the May meeting, we'll identify whether there's any kind of changes we're going to make or not. And then we'll just work with everybody to try to get agreements in place. I'm going to target June 30th, 2023 to have these agreements in place. And that gives us certainty for preparing the 2024 budget. So that's my thinking to date. Next slide. The other piece that we're going to do with staff here starting in the next couple of weeks is these regulations have some specific language, and I want to work through them in a way that I understand whether or not there's actually some hidden gaps that we didn't understand or are not implementing, or whether we're doing something in excess of what the regulation currently would require us to do. And we'll try to document all that and see if there's any kind of adjustments we have to make in how we do our work or in what we do, and whether that has any kind of a resourcing implication or any kind of other kinds of things we have to adjust to. I think the board needs to have some assurance at some time before 2024 that we are in fact meeting the program and service requirements that are laid out in the regulation. So we want to go through that process, make some adjustments so we can give the board the assurance of that. I think that's the last slide, Karen. Sorry, second last slide. So more to come. There's another phase 2 package of regulations. There'll be regulations dealing with establishing policies for setting fees and guidance on how to do that. There'll be further adjustments on how to go about dealing with setting the levy, and in particular, what components of governance and corporate services are covered in the generic levy or the base levy. We're still anticipating changes to the Section 28 regulations where we issue our permits, and there's a whole bunch of sections that are not yet proclaimed in the legislation that will be proclaimed once these regulations take effect. So this is still another 2 years. Maybe in the next 6 months we'll see phase 2, but this is still a 2-year journey to get to our new world. Back to my earlier comment today that the journey started in June 2019 when the legislation was amended. So it's a 4-year journey so far. I think that is the last slide.
Thank you, Dan. Bring everybody back up. Are there any questions on that? Carl?
Thank you, Dan, for that summary. A lot of detail there. My question has to do on page 6, talked about mandatory activities, including property ownership measures such as fencing, signage, and patrolling to prevent unlawful entry. Do you not see some major concern with that with the properties we own? Because I'm not sure the fencing is, in all cases, on the borderline or on the boundary.
We know of 1 or 2 incidences of trespass. We know that we don't have fences on all our properties. We don't have adequate signage on all our properties. We have to take some risk-based, we have to make some improvements that hopefully manage the greatest risks that are out there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Other questions? Okay, well, I like the way you describe it, Dan, as a journey, and we're somewhere in the middle of it.
Yeah.
But
sounds like the Wizard of Oz, eh?
Yeah. Although, given what we've gotten, it would look like this journey will end on January 1st, 2020. Okay, we're going to receive all of those reports in one motion. So we've done the CAO report. We did the legislative and regulatory changes. Is there any questions on the financial activity and Section 28 permits? I don't see any. I just wanted to make a note of in going through the work plan there that I think everything was green with one exception, and that was totally out of our control. So that's I think that's good to note. And the one item that wasn't in green had to do with the legislative change that hasn't taken place. I did have a question on the financial report. In looking at the financial report, which I think is 9 months, it looks like we might be heading to somewhat of a surplus by year end. Am I reading too much into that, or does that seem to be where we're going?
So Denise and I, we're not quite grounded on that one yet. We've had a couple looks at it over the last few weeks. We think on the operating side, it's in the range of 80 to 100,000, and we think on the capital side, it's in the $30,000 to $40,000 range. I'm going to expend a bit of that money. For instance, we have a loan right now for the Warsaw Caves Comfort Zone. We've had it for 10 years. We owe 23,000 on it. We think we should pay that off this year and give ourselves relief on a go-forward basis. So there's a few things we can do that has, doesn't affect the financials at the end of the day. So we're looking to do that. But right now our numbers in the 130 to 150 combined operating and capital.
And that, I think, to Gary's point about the importance of feeding the reserves and not just drawing from.
Yeah. And an example I gave you is if we're able to do something this year to give relief to out years, we'll do that too. So there's a combination of contribute to reserve and create some relief.
Good. Okay, colleagues, I'll entertain if there are any other questions. Don't seem to be any. I'll entertain a motion to receive all three of those reports under reports for information. Okay, Diane, seconded by Mike. All those in favor? Carried. Okay, colleagues, there was both correspondence and media. Did anybody want to speak to any one of those items? Don't see any. Somebody want to move receipt of those items? Don't think somebody. Okay, Diane, seconded by Paula. Okay, any discussion? All in favor? Carried. Okay, just before we go, we're going to go into closed session, but I'm just going to finish up so that we don't have to come back out. The future meetings, November the 18th is our next board meeting. The source protection meeting will be on the same date. And the next Conservation Ontario Council is on December the 6th. All of those are online. Okay, colleagues, I need to have a motion to go into closed. Moved by Tracy, seconded by Diane. All those in favor?